In this module, we'll begin by restating the goals of tariff making. We'll clarify some of the terms that I'll use throughout this module, and we'll end by stating the regulatory questions that enter into electric tariffs for EVs. Then we'll look at residential customer tariffs and charging personal use vehicles. Next, we'll look at public charging, the infrastructure needed, and how the relevant commercial tariff can affect the deployment of public charging. We'll then look briefly at charging fleets of electric vehicles, public buses, delivery vehicles, as well as ride-hailing services. Rate making is about more than just charging electric vehicles. There are a number of public interest goals that electricity regulators have to keep in mind. There can be no burden shifting from EV owners to customers who don't own EVs. Ideally, the electricity tariffs should encourage the cost-effective deployment of EVs across all sectors of the economy and across all income groups. A second public interest goal is to provide price signals to encourage charging behaviors that beneficially shape system load and reduce system costs. Finally, an emerging public interest is to use EV charging as a new source of demand response and grid flexibility. This is especially important if the government is encouraging the expansion of utility-scale wind and solar generation. There are three types of charges on an electricity bill. These charges are the tools for designing an electricity tariff that is fair and friendly to EVs. The energy charge is the total amount of electrons that flow through the customer's meter for the billing period. Energy is charged in kilowatt hours, a volumetric measure that's like liters of water coming out of a faucet. Then there's the demand charge. This is like the size of the water faucet. The bigger the faucet, the more water can flow at any given time. Demand is measured in kilowatts. The largest amount of energy consumed at any time during the month is the demand. The bill will also have a fixed charge, sometimes called the meter charge. This is a constant amount charged every month regardless of energy or demand. The simplest tariff is an energy charge. It measures the amount of energy flowing to the customer's home or business and applies a per kilowatt hour charge to the total. But there are two relatively new types of tariff models that affect EV charging, and we'll be talking a lot about them in this module. The first is time of use, or TOU rates. This requires a special meter that records not only how much energy is used, but when it is used. Rates are higher during time blocks corresponding to higher system costs. This encourages the customer to shift consumption to low-cost hours. The second model, which is new even in the United States, is demand response, or DR. A DR tariff involves a special credit that is paid to the customer for voluntarily shifting real-time usage in response to an instruction from the utility during an emergency event. DR programs are often an addition to a normal tariff and require special communications with the utility. Most personal use EV charging occurs at home. At least this is what the first years of the EV market looked like in the United States. Personal vehicles parked overnight in the garage. A peculiar feature of the U.S. market was the need to choose a voltage level for charging. Homes are wired primarily for 110 volt currents, and most devices run at 110 volts. Only a few heavy-duty appliances, like cooking stoves, run at 220 volts, and these appliances require special wiring. It's possible to charge an EV at 110 volts. This is called level 1 charging or trickle charging. You can plug into a normal outlet, but charging the vehicle takes a long time. Charging at 220 volts is faster, but it requires special wiring and a special Level 2 charging device. This chart shows that 9/10 of personal use EV charging occurs at home, with most of that done with 220-volt Level 2 chargers. Only a small portion of charging is done at public charging stations or at workplace charging stations. So, EV charging involves residential electricity tariffs for home charging and commercial electricity tariffs for public charging and fleet charging. From the regulator's perspective, home charging through residential tariffs raises two issues. The first is whether EV charging actually needs a special residential tariff that is separate from the standard residential tariff. The second issue for the regulator to consider is whether to anticipate residential EV charging as an overnight source of demand response. EV charging raises different regulatory questions for commercial applications. The balance between the per kilowatt hour energy charge and the per kilowatt demand charge affects the price signals and how customers might adapt their behaviors. The problem is, as EV usage increases, a larger share of the utility's revenue from a commercial tariff will come from energy charges rather than demand charges. Thus, the tariff might need frequent true-up adjustments to prevent over-recovery or under-recovery of revenue. Another important question is whether the utility itself should provide charging services or whether it should support competitive third-party charging providers. Let's dive into the residential segment first. Time-of-use tariffs for residential customers were the first tariffs that were friendly to EV owners. They provide a means to shift the majority of EV charging to times when the energy charge is lower, and this is often at night. This shifts a large part of the utility's total load to hours when the system-wide marginal cost of energy is low. It helps reduce system peak load, evens out the total use of the grid throughout the day, and could even delay the need for infrastructure upgrades. This creates savings opportunities for both the utility and EV owners. Experience among utilities in the United States suggests that a significant amount of load will shift if off-peak rates are about half as high as peak period rates. But do you need to have a separate tariff for EV charging to get this effect? The grid doesn't really care where the load shifting comes from, be it electric vehicles or electric stoves. Indeed, of the 135 utilities that have residential TOU tariffs in the United States, only 7 of them have special offerings that are specific to charging personal use EVs at home. This chart shows a sampling of TOU rate programs in the United States. On average for all utilities, the ratio of peak period rates to off-period rates is about 2.3 to 1. There is another issue related to time-of-use rates, however. If the rate itself is not properly designed, high penetration of EV ownership and at-home charging might not actually reduce peak load. It might simply move the peak to later in the evening and make it spikier. These graphs illustrate how that could happen using data from one EV market in the United States. The top graph shows the simulated system load with accelerated EV deployment, but no time-of-use rates. Vehicle charging increases the peak, but it still occurs around 6 p.m., roughly the same time as the peak would have occurred without the additional load from EV charging. The bottom graph shows what happens when adding a TOU tariff. Load at 6 p.m., the old peak, stays relatively flat even with a lot of EVs. But a new peak occurs. Vehicle charging surges to right after the beginning of the off-peak pricing period. This largely negates the value of time of use pricing. The solution would be to find some way to spread charging start times over 2 or 3 hours after the off-peak period begins. One way to do this is with demand response. This is an emerging area of tariff design. It requires a smart charger, a device that can receive real-time instructions from the utility to change the level of charging. To illustrate, consider an L2 charger. A not-so-smart L2 charger will run at 6 kilowatts as soon as the vehicle is plugged in, and it will continue running at 6 kilowatts until the vehicle is charged. On the other hand, you can tell a smart charger to start running at a power level that is lower than 6 kilowatts. This allows the charger to increase or decrease its power instantaneously if a signal from the utility tells it to do so. Charging the vehicle takes a little longer, but that might not matter for customers charging overnight. 1,000 L2 chargers, each reducing power by just 1 kilowatt, gives the utility the equivalent of 1 megawatt of quick response generation capacity. And this replaces the need to get that same megawatt from a gas combustion turbine or other fossil fuel unit. This flexibility has a lot of value to the utility, especially if the alternatives are expensive. Typically, a demand response tariff gives the customer a special capacity payment for each kilowatt of responsiveness that the customer makes available for a specified time period. At this point, however, DR tariffs are mostly limited to commercial customers. Apart from some pilot programs, few are available to residential customers. The question for the utility and its regulators is whether to anticipate residential demand response. Incentives for customers to install smart chargers instead of the ordinary not-so-smart chargers would increase the amount of EV load that could participate in demand response in the future. These next 2 slides describe 2 demand response pilot projects. We won't go into their details feature by feature, but some highlights are worth noting. First, participation appears to be sensitive to the additional cost of smart chargers. This suggests that utility rebates for smart chargers could help program success. Another influencing factor was the vehicle's state of charge. If the vehicle's battery charge is very low when the customer plugs in at night, the customer might want to opt out of providing demand response that evening to make sure the vehicle is fully charged by morning. Conversely, if the battery starts out with a high charge, there is less opportunity to increase or decrease the charging level throughout the night. Besides time of use pricing and demand response, the utility can also use non-tariff tools to encourage good EV charging practices. It can provide rebates for preferred chargers, and it can provide rebates or utility-paid technicians to install the chargers. If the customer purchases EV service equipment from the utility can allow the customer to pay over time instead of all at once. We'll finish our look at the residential sector with the particular challenges posed by multifamily housing. Most everything we've discussed up to now is applicable to EV owners who live in their own house. Service to customers who live in multifamily housing is done through master metering and submetering, which is different from the single meter attached to a single family house. As EV costs come down and EV driving ranges increase, Demand for personal use EVs will spread from higher income levels to middle income levels. A larger portion of this income bracket lives in multifamily homes. If regulations and tariffs make at-home charging more difficult for customers living in multifamily residences, there will be a pent-up demand for personal use EVs. Eventually, regulators will have to revisit their rules for master metering and submetering. Unfortunately, there is little precedent as of yet. The prevalent practice in the United States is to leave charging to third-party providers, where a private company owns the charging stations and customers subscribe for charging privileges separate from what they pay to the utility in their electric bills. Let's turn now to public EV charging and charging for business. These applications pay commercial electricity tariffs. We'll start with the general challenges that affect all types of charging. Then we'll look at specific issues that apply to ride-hailing services like Grab, commercial fleets, and public transportation. The use of public charging stations is relatively low when the EV market is young. This is true for both L2 charging and for DC fast charging. A load factor measures how often electricity is used at a particular station and how much is used at a given time. A low load factor means there are just a few surges in electricity use throughout the day. A high load factor means usage is relatively constant. For a public DC fast charging station, the load factor is typically around 2%. If it's highly used, the load factor is 15 to 20%. What all this means mathematically is that when a charging station has low utilization, the demand charge will dominate the monthly bill. As the station is used more frequently, the balance will shift to the per kilowatt hour energy charge. Now this raises three questions for rate setting and rate design. First, how should a tariff balance its energy charge and its demand charge over time? What are the utility's expectations about how soon load factors will become high load factors with respect to EV deployment and vehicle charging? Second, as the cash flow balance swings from demand charge revenues to energy charge revenues, should the regulator count on having frequent true-up proceedings and rate adjustments to prevent over-recovery or under-recovery of revenue by the utility? Finally, if the utility is using its economic weight to absorb short-term losses from public charging while the EV market is young, can third-party providers be successful? Will the utility's ability to self-subsidize losses from public charging act as a barrier to competitive providers of charging services? The profitability of DC fast charging is especially sensitive to the balance between energy costs and demand costs. Two things have made that balance easier to manage, however: improvements in battery storage and lower costs for solar power. NREL studied how storage and solar might affect the economics of DC fast charging using commercial tariffs in the United States. The analysis found that demand charges higher than $10 per kilowatt tend to make adding battery storage more reasonable. It also found that in areas with good solar potential, energy charges higher than 13 cents per kilowatt hour tended to improve the economics of adding PV panels to the charging station. Both of these thresholds for demand charges and energy charges are consistent with peak period pricing under a typical time-of-use commercial tariff. Let's now look at charging fleets of commercial electric vehicles. First, let's consider the possible effect of tariff design on ride-hailing services like Grab, Uber, and Lyft. NREL conducted a case study of one city in the United States with a population of 900,000 and a hypothetical ride-hailing fleet of more than 3,700 electric vehicles. The results identified an optimum need for 12 DC fast charging stations throughout the city. The study found that variable costs, including the energy component of the electricity tariff, had the greatest impact, more so than the tariff's demand charge, infrastructure cost, installation, and other fixed and one-time costs. The study concluded that the siting of DC fast charging stations should prioritize high usage over low installation costs. The rate-making implication is that if the electricity tariff is weighted towards per kilowatt demand charges, it will favor high-use areas. There is a lot we don't yet understand about commercial EV fleets. We need more research to understand causes and behavioral effects. However, we can draw some tentative conclusions from the little data we have. First, for long-distance applications, battery degradation is a bigger economic factor than energy costs. In other words, the business decision is whether to increase the number of vehicles in the delivery fleet and run each one less to conserve battery life, or to have fewer vehicles and run them a lot and absorb the cost of frequent vehicle replacement. Shorter routes, such as in-city delivery, are different. They're more responsive to price incentives in electricity tariffs, and in many cases have more flexibility in how vehicles are charged during the day. One potentially surprising conclusion is that using only DC fast charging as a fleet charging strategy might not be cost-effective in some cases once you take into account the additional cost of battery degradation, additional infrastructure costs, and tariff design. Other studies have looked at charging fleets of electric buses for public transportation. One NREL study compared charging at bus depots and en-route bus stops with charging at large facilities such as university campuses. This study found that the costs for bus charging were 32% lower when the charging was combined with a larger load. If the charging takes place at a bus depot, the charging load overshadows the depot's normal load, and this increases the depot's demand charges significantly. On the other hand, charging the buses at a university had an almost undetectable effect on demand charges. This is due both to the size and the timing of bus charging compared to the university's electric usage. These charts illustrate the effect, zooming in on the first week of the year that was studied. The top chart shows the instantaneous load at a bus depot where bus charging took place. Notice how spiky the demand is. This translates into an almost seven-fold increase in demand charges on the depot's electric bill. The bottom chart shows metered load when the bus charging is done at a university. Not only is the charging demand small relative to the university's load, the charging peak occurs during the university's off-peak load. Thus, the demand charge overall is unchanged. The cost of charging the buses shows up only in the electricity component of the bill. Let's review some of the points we've discussed. Time is a complicating factor in tariff design for all types of EV uses. As EV deployment grows, energy charges will collect more revenue, while demand charge revenues could remain relatively flat. Consequently, the utilities regulator should anticipate frequent true-up proceedings to make short-term corrections to tariff rates. Regulators will also need to decide how tariffs should deal with future technologies. Specifically, Should they provide incentives for smart charging even though demand response tariffs are not yet in place? The regulator should also decide what role competition will play in the provision of public charging. The balance between energy charges and demand charges, and how that balance might change over time, is the foundation for private sector business models for public EV charging. The more variable and uncertain these rates are, the harder it will be for third-party providers to stay in business. If the utility itself provides public charging, it might put third-party providers at a competitive disadvantage and deter their entry into the market. If government policy is to allow competition, it should be approached intentionally and deliberately. In many countries, at-home charging for personal use EVs is the first part of the market that develops. Therefore, the regulator should consider modifications to residential tariffs that would encourage charging habits that keep system costs low. Perhaps normal time-of-use tariffs will do the trick. Perhaps there are extra benefits from special offerings targeting residential EV owners. Unlike other types of residential load, overnight EV charging has the potential to provide grid flexibility through managed charging. The regulator might consider a long-term strategy for pairing residential time-of-use rates with demand response. Finally, the regulator and the utility should weigh unique costs related to residential tariffs and EV charging. Perhaps the most significant costs relate to metering. If home charging is to have its own tariff, it will need separate metering, and this will add cost for the utility and for the customer. Accommodating residential charging for customers who live in apartments and other types of multifamily housing will require new meters, but it might also require major changes to rules and procedures for master metering and submetering. Or it might suggest special commercial tariffs for third-party providers who would serve apartment residents who own EVs. Electric vehicles are an exciting new challenge for electricity tariff making. Each country is different, but there's always value in exchanging experiences. Thank you, and good luck.